Get ready to create a complete universe, full of emotions and plot twists. And before we dive into this journey, subscribe to the channel to follow even deeper and more engaging stories. Shall we begin? The silence in room 407 of Mount Sinai Hospital was the kind that seemed to accumulate in layers, a heavy silence compressed by the machines that insisted on reminding us that life still circulated there, even if almost motionless. The patient in the bed, Henry Callahan, was not just another body sustained by technology. At 48, he was one of the most influential investors on the East Coast, known for transforming small businesses into multi-million-dollar empires. But at that moment, reduced to wires, tubes, and artificial stability, he was just a man suspended between the past and the possible end. The door opened slowly, and Nurse Ava Miller entered with a clipboard in hand. The 29-year-old had only been at the hospital for 3 years, but had already gained fame for handling difficult cases. Not through miraculous skill, but through her insistence on treating each patient as someone who still had something to say, even when they couldn't speak. She stopped beside the bed, observing Henry as if studying a puzzle. His face, once featured in business magazines, now seemed frail, his expressions frozen by weeks of unconsciousness. Ava adjusted the sheet with precise, unhurried movements, as if tidying the room were part of the process of keeping him alive. The routine was always the same: checking vital signs, adjusting hydration levels, checking for minor reactions. But that morning, something seemed out of place. Perhaps it was the way the light streamed through the window, painting the room with a yellowish hue reminiscent of new beginnings at dawn. Perhaps it was just intuition, the kind Ava rarely ignored. While he was carrying out the procedures, the door opened again. A man entered, impeccably dressed, with a stern expression. It was Richard Collins, Henry's longtime lawyer, and the closest thing he had to an ally in the corporate world. "Nothing yet?" he asked, crossing his arms as if awaiting a report. Ava didn't take her eyes off the monitors as she answered. "The vital signs remain stable, but there has been no significant change in the level of consciousness." Richard let out an impatient sigh. He approached the bed, observing Henry with a mixture of concern and frustration. The concern was obvious, the frustration inevitable. The millionaire's absence had paralyzed projects, contracts, and negotiations that depended on his sharp mind. "He can't go on like this," Richard murmured. "There's an entire company waiting for decisions." Ava raised her gaze fixed. "With all due respect, Mr. Collins, he is a patient, not an overdue spreadsheet." Richard seemed to want to retort, but something in her calm demeanor silenced him. Instead, he approached the window, opening the curtains as if the light could speed up the process. Meanwhile, Ava continued working. She adjusted the pillow, moistened the patient's lips, arranged the equipment. Small actions, but each one performed with almost ritualistic precision. And everything she did contrasted directly with Richard's methodical coldness, two distinct worlds orbiting around a man who couldn't react. The initial conflict was there, silent but alive. On one side, the pragmatism that sees lives as pieces on a corporate chessboard. On the other, the human perspective that accepts that some battles cannot be won in haste. Henry was the point of tension between these two universes. In the hallways, people were talking about the accident, a head-on collision on a back road in New Jersey. The driver of the other vehicle had died instantly. Henry, barely surviving, had arrived at the hospital in a deep coma. Nothing indicated when or if he would wake up. For some doctors, the case was too stable to be promising. For Ava, there was something that left no room for giving up. That day, she noticed a micro-expression, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement in the eyelid. It wasn't common, but it could just be an involuntary reflex. Still, Ava mentally registered it, and as she walked to leave the room, something involuntary, perhaps an impulse, perhaps a gesture guided by intuition, caused her to lean slightly over the patient. She spoke a low phrase, almost a whisper, but one laden with meaning. Richard watched her, unsure why she was talking to someone who hadn't responded in weeks. But Ava didn't explain. She simply spoke and left, leaving behind something that resonated louder than the surrounding machinery. Behind her, Richard remained motionless for a few seconds, as if trying to decode the scene. He was used to strategies, calculations, probabilities. But there in the silent room, he realized that perhaps he wasn't dealing with logic, but rather with something he couldn't name. When the door closed, leaving Henry alone again, one detail went unnoticed. A slight movement in the fingertips of his right hand, so small it could have been ignored, but real enough to mark the beginning of something unexpected. The mystery was planted. The phrase Ava had uttered, the one he would never forget, would be the key to an awakening no one anticipated. The contrast between corporate urgency and human care was clear. The conflict began to take shape not only in Henry's clinical condition, but in the silent struggle between those who wanted him to return out of necessity, and those who wanted him to return because lives have value beyond numbers. And so, amidst machines and opposing intentions, the story began to take shape. The afternoon shift at Mount Sinai used to be busier, but room 407 remained a small, isolated universe, where time and routine revolved around a single patient. For Ava, that space wasn't just a workplace. It was a territory where stories intertwined. Decisions became destiny, and fragile lives demanded more than medical techniques. They demanded humanity. The hospital itself was an imposing structure. Located on Manhattan's Upper East Side, it reflected the city's fast pace, doctors rushing through corridors, screens flashing with electronic medical records, anxious visitors following the news. But behind the American efficiency in healthcare, there was also a multicultural environment where professionals from different backgrounds moved like parts of a living organism. And it was in this context that Ava trained as a nurse, amidst high pressures and rigorous expectations. At first glance, she didn't seem like someone with a heavy baggage, but the stubborn calm she carried was the result of experiences she never talked about. Before working at Mount Sinai, she had worked in emergency units in Boston, where she dealt with extreme cases and quick decisions. There she learned that some patients responded to subtle stimuli, almost invisible to less attentive professionals. And it was this sensitivity that caught the attention of her supervisors when she arrived in New York. Ava grew up in Ohio, the daughter of a teacher and a maintenance technician. She was the first in her family to work in healthcare. She carried with her the simple heritage of the American Midwest: firmness, empathy, and an unsettling tendency to notice the suffering of others too much. Perhaps that's why she quickly became attached to Henry Callahan's case. Henry, on the other hand, came from a completely different world. Born in Connecticut into a family of private investors, he grew up amidst corporate dinners, meetings, and exorbitant expectations. By age 22, he had already sold his first startup for millions. By 35, he managed a technology and renewable energy empire. He was known for his analytical, almost cold decisions, and for his singular ability to see opportunities where others saw risks. To the public, he was brilliant. To his colleagues, ruthless. To his few close friends, a man who rarely rested. His company, Callahan Industries, supported thousands of jobs and influenced entire sectors of the economy. That's why Henry's coma wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a corporate disaster. In the Midtown Manhattan offices, rumors swirled like dust in the wind. Nervous investors, vice presidents vying for space, frantic emergency meetings. Richard Collins, the lawyer who frequently visited the hospital, was at the center of this turmoil. Tall, meticulous, and calculating, he was the type of man who never let on what he truly felt. He had worked alongside Henry for over 10 years, and although many believed they made a perfect pair, the truth was more complex. Richard admired Henry, but also feared him. and the businessman's absence had left a vacuum that threatened to engulf everything around it. That same afternoon after the visit, Richard gathered the board of directors on one of the highest floors of Callahan Industries. The setting reflected the company's spirit: enormous windows, panoramic views of New York, and a minimalist aesthetic that conveyed power. The executives settled at the table, anxious for answers that Richard didn't have. Meanwhile, Ava's life continued at a completely different pace. After checking on Henry, she moved on to other patients, adjusting medications, offering comfort, and resolving minor incidents. But her thoughts always returned to room 407. Something inside her insisted that Henry was more present than he seemed. Perhaps it was just professional sensitivity, or perhaps it was that micro-expression she had noticed that morning. Back in the room, during the shift change, Ava met Diane Nichols, another experienced nurse who had worked there for 15 years. Diane had a more pragmatic approach, typical of someone who had seen many patients come and go. "You seem thoughtful," Diane said while checking the equipment. "I think he reacted today," Ava replied. Diane gave him a skeptical but not disrespectful look. "Many patients in a deep coma exhibit reflexes. This does not mean they are conscious." "I know," Ava replied, "but something seems different to me." Diane shrugged but smiled slightly. "You have good intuition. Just don't let it turn into excessive hope." Ava didn't answer. She knew Diane spoke from experience, not from harshness. In the days that followed, small changes began to emerge. Subtle movements, minimal variations in heart rate at certain times of day, almost imperceptible instabilities in his breathing when someone spoke to him. Ava recorded everything, while Richard insisted on formal reports, and doctors tried to establish patterns. And the phrase, the one Ava had said almost impulsively, remained in her mind, as if she had deposited something in the air that had not yet fully manifested itself. Every particle of the environment seemed to store tensions. The corporate pressure from outside, Ava's silent stubbornness, Henry's fragile stability, Diane's professional skepticism. All orbiting around a typical American setting, an advanced hospital, a city that never sleeps, lives that move at different paces, but always intertwined. The stage was set. The characters were connected, and the first cracks in the coma began to emerge. The first week after that micro-expression passed quickly, marked by a sequence of small incidents that, in isolation, might seem irrelevant, but which, from Ava's clinical perspective, painted a pattern that was difficult to ignore. The heart monitor registered slight fluctuations whenever she entered the room. Her oxygen saturation rose a few points when she spoke. Her breathing became slightly deeper when she touched his arm. Subtle, but constant. Ava documented everything, even knowing that many doctors would treat it as physiological coincidences. But she couldn't ignore it. There was something about Henry that seemed to respond to the environment in a specific way, especially to her. On Monday morning, the lead physician, Dr. Jonathan Hale, called a meeting with the team. Dr. Hale was known for his scientific objectivity, a renowned neurologist who always relied on evidence, never on instinct. "We observed some neurological irregularities," he said, examining graphs. "Possible brainstem reflexes, perhaps even residual signs of sensory processing. But it's not yet enough to speak of recovery." Diane nodded, while Ava kept her gaze fixed on the report, trying to identify any detail that would confirm her hunch. "I recommend we maintain the current approach," the doctor concluded. "Until further notice, the prognosis remains guarded." Those words, spoken with such coldness, unsettled Ava. She knew doctors needed to be cautious, but something about Hale's categorical tone made her uneasy. At the end of the meeting, when everyone had left, she stayed. "Doctor, there's something I'd like to show you." She opened her tablet and displayed short videos she had discreetly recorded. Minimal finger movements, small changes in breathing patterns, almost imperceptible reactions to the sound of her voice. Hale watched without interrupting. "They're interesting," she admitted, "but not conclusive. I suggest caution, Nurse Miller." Ava took a deep breath. "I suggest you exercise caution, Doctor." Hale raised an eyebrow, surprised by the audacity, but he didn't retort. He simply saved the tablet and ended the conversation. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, the corporate conflict intensified. Richard Collins had called another meeting with the board of directors of Callahan Industries. The instability caused by Henry's absence began to generate speculation in the financial media. Specialized blogs discussed a possible merger, while foreign investors tried to anticipate moves. Richard maintained a firm posture, but internally he felt the ground crumbling beneath him. He knew better than anyone that Henry had never left clear instructions regarding succession, and that made every decision a risk. "We need an official statement," said one of the vice presidents. "The market can't be left in the dark." "And what position do you suggest?" Richard retorted. "That the founder is unconscious and there are no predictions." The room fell silent. His internal conflict was evident. Between preserving Henry's image and protecting the company, Richard constantly wavered. And deep down, he carried a burden of guilt. He had been responsible for scheduling the meeting Henry was trying to reach on the day of the accident. He wasn't directly to blame, but that didn't lessen the weight that accompanied him daily. Back at the hospital, Ava noticed that the atmosphere around Henry was also beginning to change. Doctors, now aware of the records she had presented, were visiting more frequently. Diane observed the case with less skepticism. Technicians adjusted parameters more carefully, but tensions also arose. That afternoon, while Ava was changing the bandage on Henry's chest, the door was abruptly opened. It was Richard. His expression carried a kind of urgency that made it clear the visit was not a routine one. "How is he?" he asked directly, almost cutting through the air in the room. "No significant changes," Ava replied, keeping her focus on the procedure. "No changes is no longer enough," he murmured, approaching the bed. "The company is on the brink of crisis. We need decisions." Ava slowly raised her gaze. "He is a patient in a coma. He cannot make decisions." "But he could die," Richard retorted, in a tone that sounded too cold even for him. "And that would change everything." The word hung in the air, heavy, awkward. Ava took a deep breath, suppressing her irritation. "Don't talk like that in front of him," she said seriously. "He's not dead. Don't act like he is." Richard seemed about to answer, but hesitated. His expression wavered for a second, revealing guilt, frustration, and weariness. Then he turned and left, without saying anything more. Still, the damage was done. As soon as the door closed, the heart monitor displayed a sharp fluctuation, a sudden change, almost as if Henry had reacted to Richard's presence or words. Ava wrote down the information immediately. The conflict between her and Richard intensified, fueled by completely different perspectives. He, pressured by corporate survival; she, guided by the conviction that Henry was still there, fighting in some way. The next day, another change occurred. When Ava entered the room at 7 a.m., she found the neural physiotherapist, Elena Vasquez, performing motor stimulation. Elena was known for her meticulous approach and advanced methods. And at that moment, what she observed was significant. "Did you see that?" Elena asked excitedly. "Involuntary flexion, but more pronounced than before. It could be a sign of improvement." Ava felt her heart race. "Do we have records?" he asked. "I'm already documenting everything." The atmosphere was beginning to change. Before, only Ava believed in Henry's silent progress. Now, experts were starting to notice concrete signs. But the more the recovery seemed to be on the horizon, the more tension increased outside. Henry's company was heading towards a forced restructuring. The internal board pressured Richard daily. Rumors about a partial sale began to leak. Even without full awareness, Henry seemed to react emotionally to each new conflict. That afternoon, when Ava casually mentioned that new directors were trying to take control of the company, the monitor registered another abrupt change. "He's noticing," she murmured, almost in a low voice, as if talking to herself. And at that moment he realized the conflict was no longer just about hospitals or corporations. It was personal, deep, between those who wanted to protect Henry and those who wanted to use him as a pawn, between those who believed he could return and those who already treated him as if he were gone. At the center of it all, a motionless man, and yet still fighting. And what no one knew was that the phrase Ava had said days before continued to resonate somewhere deep within his mind, poised to emerge as a decisive force. The following weeks brought a clear increase in the complexity of Henry Callahan's case. What had previously seemed an unlikely recovery began to transform into a series of small advances that, added together, traced an upward curve. The hospital routine, always so rigid and predictable, began to revolve around that bed, and with that, new subplots began to emerge. The first involved Elena Vasquez, the neural physiotherapist. Her restrained enthusiasm transformed into intense dedication. At 34, Elena had immigrated from Mexico as a teenager, bringing with her the determination to build a solid and innovative career. She was a pioneer in motor-responsive stimulation techniques that combine neuroscience with auditory micro-interactions, something that many professionals at the hospital still treated with skepticism. But Elena was undeterred. With medical clearance, she began short, frequent sessions with Henry. In one of them, while applying targeted stimuli to her forearm, she noticed a stronger response than expected. "That's not a reflex," she murmured, quickly writing it down. "It's almost an attempt at movement." Ava, who was watching from the doorway, immediately approached. "Is he trying to fight back?" "I can't say for sure yet," Eleanor replied, maintaining her professionalism. "But that intensity is not common in primary reflexes." These observations created a connection between Ava and Elena. Although they came from different areas, they shared the same determination to bring Henry back. And this alliance, however silent, began to bother other team members who believed it was a waste of time to invest so many resources in a case without a guaranteed prognosis. One of the most critical voices was that of Dr. Meredith Sloan, clinical director and one of the hospital's most respected neurologists. Her stance was rigid, based on protocols and statistics, and she frowned upon the excessive hope that some professionals demonstrated. "We need to keep our goals realistic," she stated in meetings. "We can't allow personal expectations to compromise clinical accuracy." The criticism was indirect, but Ava and Eleanor knew exactly who it was directed at. At the same time, corporate tensions surrounding Callahan Industries reached their peak. Henry's prolonged absence allowed an internal power struggle for executive control to begin to take shape. Two vice presidents, Mark Henderson and Lauren Blake, saw the coma as an opportunity to expand their influence. Mark, with his aggressive stance and skill in manipulating numbers and opinions, advocated for an immediate restructuring, including the sale of entire subsidiaries. Lauren, more subtle, preferred to work behind the scenes, influencing shareholders and board members with her strategic and elegant vision. Richard, caught in the middle of this battle, found himself under increasing pressure. He needed to show strength, but he had lost some of his internal support. His visits to the hospital became more frequent, not out of genuine concern for Henry, but because the company's corporate fate depended on the founder's return or death. On one of those visits, he ran into Ava in the hallway. "I need updates," he said bluntly. "The board wants answers." Ava crossed her arms, standing firm. "He is showing improvement." Richard raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Is this enough improvement for a prediction?" "Recovery doesn't work like that," she replied. "But I can assure you he's reacting to his environment." "Reaction is not awareness," Richard retorted. Ava took a deep breath to contain her frustration. "You should try talking to him, Mr. Collins." Why? Because maybe he'll listen, she said, with such conviction that Richard hesitated for a moment. This exchange, brief but intense, marked another important subplot: Richard's gradual transformation. Behind the facade of a calculating lawyer, there was a man grappling with guilt, fear, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. And although he resisted, something within him began to waver in the face of Ava's unwavering determination. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, a new layer of complexity emerged with the arrival of an unexpected visitor, Claire Lawson, an investigative journalist known for her in-depth stories about American corporations. Claire had discovered that Callahan Industries was facing instability and believed there was more to the company's silence. She had tried to contact Richard several times, without success, so she decided to go to the hospital. With her confident bearing, dark hair pulled back in a bun, and a sharp gaze accustomed to sniffing out secrets, Claire introduced herself at reception and tried to access the inpatient ward. She couldn't. But a few minutes of observing the activity were enough to identify a pattern. Every time Richard appeared, he followed the same route, avoided certain corridors, and maintained an excessively reserved posture when entering and leaving. Claire couldn't get into the room, but she did find something even more valuable, a story about to explode. This new threat, the press, became another layer in the conflict. If news leaked, investors would panic and the company could collapse. Meanwhile, Henry, trapped between worlds, seemed to react more and more to the voices surrounding him. In monitored sessions, his brainwaves showed sudden spikes when Ava spoke about choices, about decisions, about corporate injustices. It was as if some part of him understood the gravity of what was happening outside the hospital, and there was always, the phrase Ava had said on the first day, the phrase no one knew, but which was becoming a guiding thread within his mind, stitching together scattered fragments of memory and consciousness. The pressure was mounting. The medical team was divided between skepticism and hope. Physical therapy showed progress, but it was still fragile. The lawyer fought against internal forces that wanted to seize power. The journalist was getting closer to a story that could change everything. And silently, this tangle of external conflicts began to be reflected in Henry's own body, as if his mind, even asleep, was trying to react to the chaos of the world to which he still belonged. In the viscous darkness in which Henry Callahan was trapped, time had no form. There were no days, nights, defined sounds or clear images. There were only echoes, memories, sensations, fragments of an entire life floating in a thick void. Sometimes they surfaced like flashes of light underwater, other times like distant voices reverberating through an endless tunnel. He was not aware of his own body. He didn't know if his eyes were open or closed. But he knew, with the visceral certainty of someone experiencing something without understanding it, that someone was trying to reach him. And this presence had a silent name, a distinct energy, something that warmed the void. Ava. The phrase she uttered on the first day, the one that pierced the barrier of the coma like an arrow, echoed within him like a confused yet powerful mantra. He didn't remember the exact words, but he remembered the intention, he remembered the force, he remembered the impact, and that was what kept him teetering on the edge between giving up and fighting. As the outside world moved with conflicts and interests, Henry's inner world began to take shape. It wasn't linear, it wasn't lucid, but it was alive. First came the distorted memories. The company cafeteria was noisy, with young engineers running around. The smell of rust mixed with oil in his first makeshift laboratory at age 19. The proud smile of the father, holding the first prototype of a machine that no one believed would work. These memories emerged like small, fragmented films, without order or context. Then came others, darker ones, tense meetings with shareholders, signing contracts I never wanted to sign, Heated discussions with Richard, his lawyer and former friend, about decisions that distanced him from his own company, and above all, the suffocating feeling of having lost control over what was once their dream. These memories were like chains pulling him down. But then there was the other voice. The voice that wasn't part of the past. The warm, patient, firm voice. The voice that spoke of choices, of struggle, of not giving up. Ava. Each time she entered the hospital room, her presence pierced the darkness like a penetrating vibration. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the intention. It was like a hand gently pushing him towards the surface. In his mind, it took on an almost physical form. He walked down an endless corridor. The walls were curved, as if he were inside a concrete tunnel, dimly lit by weak lamps. The floor seemed liquid, but solid enough to walk on. Whenever Ava approached her physical body, a warm light would appear at the end of the corridor. When she moved away, the light would fade, almost disappearing, and on the days she wasn't there, when she was off duty or busy with another patient, the hallway would become so dark that Henry was sure he was about to disappear. But something started to change. Elena's neural physiotherapy sessions introduced stimuli that crossed her threshold of consciousness. For Henry, these stimuli manifested as small, shimmering windows in the hallway. He didn't know what they meant, but each one seemed to pull him toward some kind of movement. One day, while Elena was applying a stimulus to his forearm, Henry felt as if his arm, within that inner world, were trapped under a heavy stone. He tried to lift it, without knowing he was trying. The pain was intense, but the kind that defined boundaries between body and emptiness. And, for the first time since the accident, he felt his own arm, a vague, yet real sensation. This triggered a new emotion, fear. Fear of feeling pain, fear of waking up, fear of remembering what I perhaps didn't want to know, but also hope. Hope that there was a way out, a bridge, a direction. Meanwhile, Ava's phrase, the one that had resonated with him like no other, transformed within him. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he felt its energy, its underlying message. You are not alone. That was the interpretation his mind created. Perhaps it wasn't literal, but that's how he perceived it, and that made him search for the light at the end of the corridor. The inner world took on more shape as the weeks went by. From an empty hallway, it became a labyrinth of memories, some distorted, others almost vivid. There was a room with large windows overlooking a stormy sea, a representation of the corporate chaos he imagined was unfolding. Another room filled with documents stacked to the ceiling, as if his mind were trying to organize everything he had left unfinished. And there was a white space, completely empty, where Ava's presence seemed strongest. He would go to that place often, even without knowing why. It was where he felt least lost. In one of those internal moments, he heard something clearer than ever, a short sentence, spoken in a warm, firm, human voice. He couldn't understand all the words. They were jumbled as if they came through water. But he grasped the tone, the urgency, and that made his heart, inside and out, react. The monitors in the hospital registered a sudden spike. Ava and Elena exchanged glances, unaware that at that very moment, within his own inner world, Henry had taken his first conscious step toward the light at the end of the corridor. He didn't know who that woman with the intense voice was. I didn't know what his face looked like. I didn't know why she insisted on him so much, but I knew I didn't want to remain in the void any longer. He knew that now he had a reason, even if he couldn't understand it yet. And he knew with a certainty that arose from somewhere deep within him that something grand awaited him when he finally reached the end of that illuminated corridor. Outside the silent world where Henry struggled to recover, reality seethed with tensions that accumulated like tectonic plates about to collide. The recovery, still delicate and uncertain, had become a thread that held together much more than a life. It sustained careers, businesses, reputations, and above all, truths that many preferred to remain buried. At the hospital, the atmosphere was different. Ava could sense it in the whispered conversations in the hallways, in the quick glances some doctors exchanged toward room 407. Henry's case had ceased to be merely clinical. It had become political. The clinical director, Dr. Meredith Sloan, had intensified her visits to his bedside. She observed every chart, every monitor, every note. During the rounds, she asked pointed questions. "Are you sure these peaks are significant?" he asked, staring at Elena in an almost challenging way. "There are no reflexes that produce such consistent patterns," the physiotherapist replied confidently. "He is reacting to specific stimuli, mainly auditory." Ava knew Sloan wasn't worried about Henry. She was worried about protocols, statistics, legal liability. If the recovery became something more than a medical miracle, it could lead to investigations into the patient's initial condition, decisions made, and methods used. And Sloan hated questions she couldn't control. Away from the hospital, Callahan Industries was bustling with activity. Mark Henderson and Lauren Blake continued their silent power struggle. Reports were sent and lost. Decisions were made without consensus. Rumors about Henry's condition surfaced and disappeared in private shareholder groups. Richard tried to maintain order, but his control was slipping through his fingers. He knew that if Henry woke up, everything would change, perhaps for better, perhaps for worse, depending on what he remembered. And that was the point. Richard deeply feared what Henry might remember of the day of the accident. It had been an accident, yes, but not everything was so clear. At least not for Richard, who harbored a secret that was eating him up inside. He forced himself to bury him. Every time he entered the hospital, a silent urgency filled his eyes. He observed his friend's motionless body, trying to decipher if there was consciousness there, if there was judgment, if there was memory. Don't wake up. That was the forbidden thought that sometimes haunted him. But soon after came the guilt, violent and inevitable. God, what am I thinking? And then there was Claire Lawson, the journalist. She was getting closer and closer to something big. She had managed to gather documents, collect statements, listen to conversations, analyze financial transactions. There were too many gaps, too many coincidences, too much silence. She didn't believe in coincidences. She never had. On a cold afternoon, she parked her car in front of the hospital and watched the entrance. People coming in, going out, ambulances arriving, visitors with flowers and tense expressions. The hospital was a living machine, but Claire could sense when secrets were pulsing behind the white walls and the smell of disinfectant. She knew Henry Callahan was there. She knew his condition was critical. She knew the company was unstable. But she needed to figure out how these pieces connected. And although she didn't know it yet, her investigation was about to put pressure on the very people who most wanted to remain in the shadows. In the hospital, Ava's life was changing without her even realizing it. She tried to maintain her routine, but Henry's case consumed much more than just shift hours. It consumed her nights, her thoughts, her emotional energy. She found herself thinking about him even outside of her shift. Not the millionaire patient, but the silent human being struggling within a void she could never have imagined. And in a way, the phrase she had said on the first day, the one he would never forget, was beginning to weigh on her as well. Because she hadn't said it by chance. It had come from an intimate, painful place, a place she hid even from herself. Ava had lost people in the past. People who didn't come back, no matter how much she pleaded, cared, and tried. And with Henry, she refused to lose again. Maybe it was irrational, maybe it was emotional, but she didn't care anymore. That was what nobody understood. It wasn't about blind hope. It was about not abandoning someone who could still fight, even if they didn't know it. As external conflicts intensified, something surprising happened on Thursday morning. Elena entered Henry's room with a new experimental protocol approved by the team. It was a combination of more precise auditory stimuli and light tactile vibration. Ava was beside her, adjusting sensors and preparing the environment. "Let's begin," Elena said, activating the equipment. In Henry's inner world, the illuminated corridor shone brighter than ever. The light at the end was no longer a small flame. It was an intense brightness, as if someone had opened a door in the middle of the desert. And then, for the first time, Henry heard something clearly. Your name. A firm, warm female voice called out to him. Henry Times. Ava, outside, didn't know why she felt chills, but she did. Something in the air shifted. His body seemed to react with a micro-movement of his fingers, so brief it could have been ignored. But she saw. Elena. "Look!" The physiotherapist looked at the monitor, then at his hand, and she smiled. "He is approaching." Inside, Henry took another step towards the light, and for the first time since the accident, he wasn't afraid. The news that Henry had shown new answers didn't spread quickly through the hospital, and that was intentional. Elena and Ava decided to keep the information restricted to the immediate team, knowing that any leak could turn his recovery into a public spectacle or worse, a battlefield. But inside room 407, something was already different. The air seemed more alive, more electric, as if Henry's presence was finally trying to break through the barrier between the deep world where he was trapped and the surface where everyone was waiting for him. The next day, Ava arrived at the hospital early. It wasn't her shift. She hadn't been called in, but something inside her, an instinct perhaps, led her there before dawn. The bluish light from the corridors reflected on the waxed floor, and the silence was broken only by the rhythmic footsteps of those beginning their night shift. When he arrived at the room, he found Eleanor taking notes and adjusting sensors. "You arrived early," the physiotherapist commented, but without surprise. "I knew you would come." Ava approached the bed. Henry's fingers, which had been motionless until then, seemed to have a minimal tension, almost imperceptible to anyone who hadn't been observing him for weeks. "He's fighting," Ava murmured, feeling an unexpected tightness in her chest. "It is," Eleanor confirmed, "but it needs consistency, and it needs us." Ava nodded, though she knew the word "we" hid dangerous ground. She was emotionally involved. Eleanor knew it, maybe the whole hospital knew, but no one dared mention it. Meanwhile, inside his mind, Henry continued in that luminous passage. With each step, the light seemed to expand, revealing details that were previously just blurs. Human forms, memories, disconnected fragments of laughter, busy streets, dinners with Richard, tense meetings, the sound of breaking glass. And there was that voice, a voice that didn't come from the past, but from the present. It was Ava's voice. "Come back. You're not alone." He didn't know who she was. He didn't know why it mattered so much, but he knew that voice anchored him. I knew it was real. As he moved forward, the feeling of heaviness lessened. It was as if something was reorganizing itself within him, as if the broken threads of consciousness were slowly being reconnected. But there were also barriers, shadows, and one of them was beginning to stand out with disturbing clarity. The image of the car, the rain, the headlights. The feeling that I wasn't alone at the time of the accident. The memory was hazy, but not non-existent. Henry tried to approach, but the pain surfaced, a shard of anguish, as if the memory were protected by a deep emotional block. He retreated. The pain was very intense. That's when he heard Ava's voice again, and the inner world stabilized again. Outside, the pressure was mounting. Richard received a call from Mark Henderson, the ambitious executive. "Did you see the partial report?" Mark asked coldly. "They're hiding something, recent movements, reflexes, responses." Richard took a deep breath, rubbing his tired eyes. "Henry isn't waking up. It's too early to draw conclusions." "That's not what I'm hearing from my contacts," Mark retorted. "And if he's close to that, we have a problem." "Mark, for God's sake, this is about his life," Richard retorted, mocking the other man's business-mindedness. Mark paused for too long. For you, maybe it is. For me, it's about the future of the company." Richard hung up without saying goodbye. His stomach churned. He couldn't allow corporate interests to taint his friend's medical process, but he couldn't prevent the inevitable either. If Henry were to wake up, memories would resurface, and some of them could crush careers, including his. In the hospital, a different kind of storm was brewing. Director Sloan called Ava into her office. "I see you're very involved with the patient," Sloan said, crossing his hands on the table with that icy professionalism Ava already knew. "Involved in the clinical sense, yes," Ava replied, maintaining a firm posture. "In cases like this, emotional involvement can impair decisions," Sloan continued, "and I've noticed that you've been spending more time with the patient than necessary." Ava felt her face grow hot. "I'm monitoring his progress. It's my job." "Your job is to follow protocol," Sloan retorted, leaning forward. "And protocol dictates that we can't harbor false expectations, nor let ourselves be carried away by personal impulses." For a moment, the words struck Ava like a veiled accusation, but she didn't back down. "Henry isn't reacting by coincidence. He's reacting to consistent stimuli, and I'm providing those stimuli." Sloan watched her for a long time. Then he took a deep breath. "Very well. But please know that I will be closely monitoring your performance, and if I notice any emotional interference that could compromise the treatment, I will remove you from the case." Ava left the office with trembling hands, from anger, not guilt. That afternoon she returned to her room, determined. "Well, Henry, it seems we'll have to prove some people wrong," she said, adjusting the curtains and the lighting. He took a deep breath. Then she moved closer to his ear and repeated the phrase she had said on the first day, without knowing that it would mark his destiny. A simple phrase, but one that contained all the urgency that lived within her. "If you can hear me, come back. I'm still here." It was as if his inner world had caught fire. The light at the end of the corridor expanded violently, as if pulling Henry towards it. He felt the ground vibrate beneath his feet, the passage opening, the shadows receding. And for the first time, he managed to take a full step towards clarity, a conscious step, one step from him. Outside, the monitors registered a clear increase in neural activity. The heart rate accelerated, the breathing pattern changed. Eleanor ran inside. "Ava, are you seeing this?" Yes, Ava was there, and her eyes filled with tears. Discreet, restrained, but inevitable. "He's fighting," he murmured. Eleanor smiled. "No," he corrected, "he's coming back." Inside his mind, Henry felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, a faint, fragile, but real hope, completely intertwined with the voice of that woman he didn't yet know, but already trusted. He took another step forward, and another, until, finally, the light ceased to be merely a distant destination and began to become a possible path. He was not awake, not yet. But it was closer than ever, and everyone, friends, enemies, allies, and threats, would feel the consequences of that very soon. In the days that followed Henry's significant leap, the hospital became a silent field of expectation. Not an open, vibrant expectation, but a compressed tension, kept under layers of professionalism and repeated routines. Each member of the team who entered room 407 observed everything with heightened attention. EEG patterns, micro-expressions, breathing, posture, any variation. Nothing was considered too small. Ava stood more resolute than ever, even with Sloane's veiled warning echoing in her mind. She couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when Henry was finally responding. Elena, in turn, increased the frequency of the sensory stimulation protocol, always respecting clinical limits. His progress was careful but steady. But there was something the team couldn't measure. What was happening inside Henry's consciousness? The inner world was becoming less and less clouded. The light, once distant, had transformed into a diffuse brightness around him. The corridor was no longer just a symbol. Now it had texture, it had sounds, it had depth. Each step reverberated as if he were, little by little, regaining awareness of his own body. And along with the light, familiar shapes began to emerge. Broken memories, but now recognizable. The sound of rain, the roar of an engine, a hushed-up discussion. A phone is ringing. Fragments, still disconnected, but increasingly closer to fitting together. He was moving forward, always following the voice that guided him. But there was something new there. A shadow watching him. A presence hiding at the ends of the corridor, always fleeing when he tried to reach it. That shadow had emotional weight. There was the threat of a memory that he wasn't ready to face. Still, he knew, sooner or later, he would have to face her. While Henry struggled within himself, the outside world descended into turmoil. Claire Lawson, the journalist, was much closer to a discovery than she imagined. After weeks of sifting through documents, connections, contracts, and audit files, she found an unusual trail. Financial transactions made hours before Henry's accident. Large transfers, undeclared, directed to bridge accounts typically used in clandestine transactions. She didn't have a name yet, but she had the most important thing, the certainty that something was there. It wasn't just an accident, she murmured to herself, reviewing her notes. And all the arrows, all the clues, all the patterns, they were pointing to Callahan Industries. Her research was about to explode. In the company's meeting room, Mark Henderson and Lauren Blake plotted silently. Henry's potential recovery terrified them both, for different reasons. Mark feared losing the control he had just gained in the shadows of the CEO's absence. Lauren feared that her own involvement in controversial decisions would come to light if Henry resumed control. They met behind closed doors. "We need a strategy, in case he wakes up," Lauren said, crossing her arms. "The strategy is simple," Mark retorted. "Prevent it from happening." Lauren stared at him coldly. "Are you suggesting something illegal?" "I'm suggesting something necessary. If Henry comes back conscious, he'll destroy everything we've done. And honestly, I think he already knows more than he should, even before the accident." Lauren felt a shiver, but not from fear of Henry, out of fear of Mark, because at that moment she realized that he was willing to go much further than she had imagined. Richard, on the other hand, lived in constant torment. He visited Henry every day, always in the late afternoon, when the hospital was quieter. He would crouch down beside the bed, observe his friend's face, and feel the weight of a secret that was eating away at him. "You need to come back," he whispered. "But I don't know what will happen when that happens." He touched Henry's hand, unaware that deep down his friend sensed that presence. He felt the emotional conflict hanging in Richard's voice. He felt guilt, fear, something unresolved, but I still didn't know exactly what. At the hospital, Ava was preparing for another auditory stimulation session. She adjusted the environment, took a deep breath, and approached him. "Henry, you're doing very well, but I want you to try to go deeper today. I want you to try to follow the light. If you're tired, I'm here. If you're scared, I'm here. You're not alone." She didn't know why, but she felt increasingly connected to him. It wasn't romance. It was something deeper, more inexplicable, as if she had been placed in his life at that moment for a reason she didn't yet understand. She turned on the recorder and started. In his inner world, her voice became a beacon, illuminating the space around Henry. He moved forward with more confidence. He passed through a door that had previously seemed locked, and he saw the moment immediately before the accident, himself inside the car, arguing with someone in the passenger seat. The figure was shrouded in shadow, but no longer completely undefined. Henry tried to get closer, but the pain returned, intense, like an electric shock running down the hallway. He staggered. It almost fell. The light flickered. But then he heard the phrase again, "I'm still here." And she found the strength to remain standing. The shadow receded. It didn't disappear. It just waited. He waited for the right moment to reveal himself. Outside, Eleanor was monitoring the data. "Elevated brain activity," he murmured. "He's dealing with memories." Ava felt her heart race. "Is it dangerous?" "No, it's necessary. He's starting to reconstruct the aftermath of the accident." And that was exactly the point where everything would change. Because when Henry finally remembered who was with him in the car, someone on the outside would lose everything. When the session ended, Ava approached him once more. She adjusted the sheet, gently touched his hand and said, "You're getting there. Keep going. I promise I'm not going anywhere." She didn't see it, but a single finger of his moved, an almost imperceptible but real movement. And in the darkness of the lit hallway, Henry sensed it. He was about to return, and when he returned, the world outside wouldn't be ready. On the 14th day after the first major breakthrough, the entire hospital awoke to an unusual atmosphere, a kind of silent tension that precedes storms. There were no alarms blaring, no rushing in the hallways. Yet every professional who crossed the corridor of room 407 sensed that something very important was about to happen. Ava arrived early, much earlier than she should have. She had slept poorly. The night had been punctuated by fragmented dreams involving the same image, Henry's hand trying to reach for her. When he entered the room, he found Eleanor adjusting the monitoring sensors. "Good morning," said Ava, trying to sound natural. "Perhaps so," Eleanor replied, looking at the graphs. "Look at this." Henry's brain waves were more stable, more organized, exhibiting patterns consistent with more advanced states of consciousness. It wasn't awakening, but it was as close as possible before crossing the ultimate boundary. "He's ready," Ava murmured. Eleanor did not respond, because it wasn't necessary. In his inner world, Henry was walking, but it was no longer the same foggy corridor. The light, once diffuse, now illuminated everything with increasing clarity. The shadows receded, revealing the outlines of walls, doors, memories that were trying to recompose themselves. And ahead there was something new, a sound, a beep. Then another one. After many. He recognized that sound. It was real life, and then he heard the voice that sustained him. "Henry, everything is fine. You can go." He was trying. With each step, the memories took shape, color, and presence. And then, suddenly, the shadow reappeared. This time he did not back down. This time she stood still in front of him, as if waiting for the right moment. Henry approached, driven by something stronger than fear, something closer to a necessity. When the shadow spoke, its voice was distorted but understandable. "You shouldn't have found out." The phrase exploded in her mind, and the memory shattered the barrier of pain like shards of glass. He saw, with absolute clarity. I wasn't alone in the car that night. Someone was yelling at him. Someone was holding his arm. Someone who threatened to expose something big enough to destroy not only his life, but the entire company. And now he remembered the face. The shadow was fully revealed. Ava, unaware that Henry had just crossed the most dangerous threshold in her memory, began a new session of auditory stimulation. She approached and said in a low voice, "Henry, I need you to try one more time. You're almost there." The monitors reacted. His heart raced. Brainwaves climbed like mountains on the graph. Elena's eyes widened. "Oh my God. He's accessing a traumatic memory." "Is this good?" Ava asked anxiously. "It's essential." Ava took a deep breath and continued speaking. "Whatever you saw, you're not alone. Keep going. I'm here." Inside his mind, Henry stared at the revealed shadow. Mark Henderson. Not as an ambitious executive, not as a silent adversary, but like the man who was in the car with him on the night of the accident. And now everything made sense. Mark had confronted Henry that day. He said that Callahan Industries was on the verge of a scandal. He said that if Henry didn't sign certain documents, the company would collapse, and Mark would collapse along with it. Henry refused. The two of them fought. The rain had gotten heavier. The car skidded. Mark was holding the steering wheel. Mark had tried to take control when Henry momentarily lost his sight. Mark caused the final collision by pulling the steering wheel the wrong way. It was no accident. It was despair. It was the hand of someone who had a lot to lose. The impact of the memory caused Henry to fall to his knees in the brightly lit hallway. But he didn't faint. He did not back down, because something was pulling him, something that, deep down, was stronger than fear, pain, or truth. Ava's voice. At the hospital, Claire Lawson finally gained access to documents that confirmed her suspicions. She printed them out and drove urgently to the hospital, crossing the city as if guided by a premonition. When he arrived at reception, he asked to speak to Richard immediately. He was there, as always, and escorted her to a private room. "You have to see this," said Claire, spreading the papers out on the table. Richard read quickly, and his expression paled. These movements were made hours before the accident. "Yes," Claire confirmed, "and they all bear the name Mark Henderson." Richard felt the pressure in his eyes. He felt his heart beating faster. It was the worst possible scenario. "Claire, if that's true, Henry is in danger even here." The journalist nodded. "We need to act before Mark does anything." Meanwhile, Mark and Lauren were arguing in a side meeting. "He's reacting too fast," Mark said, gritting his teeth. "If he wakes up, I'm finished." Lauren took a deep breath. "We're not going to make drastic decisions. That could ruin everything." "It's already ruined," he interrupted. "You don't understand. He knows. Henry knows. I saw it in his eyes that day. And if he wakes up, it's all over for me." The phrase hung in the air. Lauren took a step back. "You're not thinking about—" "I'm thinking about survival," Mark replied with an unsettling calm. In room 407, the climax began. The light in the inner corridor burst into brightness. The shadows disappeared, and Henry took the final step. The ground disappeared. The corridor disappeared. The light enveloped him completely. Outside, the monitors began to beep in sequence. "Elena!" Ava shouted, grabbing Henry's arm. He took a deep breath, then, again, deeper, more aware. "Oh my God," Eleanor whispered. His eyelid twitched, an earthquake, then another one. Finally, with visible effort, Henry opened his eyes. Ava brought her hand to her mouth, tears immediately welling up, as if the whole world were sinking inside her. Henry blinked, confused, trying to focus, and then very slowly, he turned his head toward the voice that had guided him for weeks. His eyes met hers. Ava held her breath, and then, in a weak, hoarse voice, almost a whisper, he uttered the phrase that marked the moment he returned to the world. "I heard you." And outside, while a nurse ran to call the medical team, a man watched from a distance, hidden in the shadows of the corridor. Mark Henderson. And he realized what that look between Henry and Ava meant. Henry remembered, and he was lost. When the doors to room 407 opened for the medical team, Ava was still holding Henry's hand, as if she needed to make sure he wouldn't slip back into the silent world from which he had just emerged. She only realized she was crying when Elena touched her shoulder. "Ava, he's back. You did it." Henry blinked slowly, trying to piece together fragments of the real world. The lights, the sounds of the equipment, the presence of various people around him, everything seemed incredibly intense after weeks trapped in his own mind. But despite the chaos, he kept his gaze fixed on Ava. Richard was the first family member to enter. His expression completely fell apart. "Henry?" Her voice trembled like never before. "Henry, are you listening to me?" Henry turned his head slowly, and he nodded. Richard covered his face with his hands, overcome by silent sobs. The team recorded signals, collected data, and noted values on tablets, but at that moment, nothing mattered except the fact that Henry was consciously breathing, speaking, seeing, and remembering. Unfortunately, He remembered more than anyone expected. News of the awakening spread throughout the hospital like wildfire. Staff members abandoned short breaks to discuss the case, patients asked if it was true, and journalists were already waiting outside with cameras. Claire Lawson was among them. She held the revealing documents against her chest, as if they were loaded weapons. As soon as he learned that Henry was conscious, he stormed into the lobby and demanded access. He wasn't just a journalist at that moment. He was the only person who had concrete proof that the accident wasn't an accident at all. Ava stayed by Henry's side while the team conducted the initial neurological assessments. "He blinked at me 3 times, said the neurologist. Excellent response. But it was when he asked, "Henry, can you say my name?" that the room fell into absolute silence. Henry frowned in effort. Her lips trembled, and he tried, Ava." She placed her hand on her heart, unable to contain her emotional smile. "That's right," she said, leaning closer. "It's me. I'm here." The monitors registered another peak. Not alarming, but clear. Her presence reassured him. Outside, as Claire walked down the hallway, Mark Henderson waited in a corner, watching everything with narrowed eyes. His breathing was shallow, as if he were trying to decide whether to run away or act before it was too late. Lauren arrived, breathless. "Mark, please, don't do anything. Things are bad enough already." He looked at her as if she were an obstacle. "Do you think there's still a way out for me?" she whispered. Lauren did not respond. Because the truth was inevitable. It didn't exist. In the hospital security room, Richard and Claire gathered evidence. Suspicious financial transactions, veiled threats, deleted messages, but recovered. And confirmation that Mark Henderson was the only one to get out of the car alive, besides Henry. "We need to call the police immediately," Claire said. Richard sighed deeply, exhausted. "He worked with us for 9 years. My family trusted him." "And she almost lost Henry because of that confidence," Claire retorted. Richard didn't argue. The truth hurt, but it was undeniable. Meanwhile, in room 407, Henry mustered his last bit of strength to ask for something. "Ava," he murmured. She leaned over. "What do you need?" His voice was weak but laden with urgency, as if it came directly from the epicenter of the memory that had brought him back. "He was with me." Ava froze. "Who, Henry?" His eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Mark!" She swallowed hard. "Do you remember?" He nodded, and her world changed in that instant. Seconds later, Mark entered the hallway that led to room 407. Ava came out at that very moment, carrying a tray with new bandages. The shock was instant. Their eyes met. She saw something dark there, something that was neither regret nor guilt. It was despair. And despair is capable of making anyone destroy everything around them. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but there wasn't time. Richard appeared behind him, accompanied by 2 police officers. "Mark Henderson," one of the officers said, "you are under arrest for the crimes of attempted murder, corporate fraud, and obstruction of justice." The entire hospital seemed to hold its breath. Mark slowly raised his hands, but his gaze never left Ava's. "He shouldn't have woken up," she whispered. Ava replied firmly, "He woke up because you couldn't destroy what was keeping him alive. The police took him away." And for the first time in many years, the hospital corridor seemed illuminated by something other than fluorescent lights. For the first time, he seemed illuminated by hope. Hours later, when the commotion had subsided, Ava returned to her room. Henry was awake, his eyes tired but alert. She approached slowly. "You're safe now," she said. "Everyone is looking after you." Henry took a deep breath, and as he exhaled, he spoke the phrase that would seal their fate. "I only came back because I listened to you." Ava felt her heart sink, and he realized in that instant that no barrier, not silence, not shadow, not coma, could prevent 2 lives from meeting when destiny insisted. "Then stay," she whispered, holding his hand, "because I heard you too." And, for the first time since the accident, Henry smiled. The beginning of something none of them would ever forget. 6 months later, Henry walked slowly through the rehabilitation garden, still regaining some mobility, but steady. Ava accompanied him, now not just as a nurse, but as someone who had chosen to remain by his side. The Henderson case had become a national issue, revealing layers of corporate corruption. Henry, however, chose to move on, rebuilding his life quietly and purposefully. Upon reaching the bench where he used to practice his balance, he smiled at Ava. "It's amazing how we ended up exactly where we were supposed to be." She smiled back, and in that simple instant, they both knew the worst was behind them. If this story touched you in any way, whether through the strength of hope, the courage against injustice, or the transformative power of a single voice, share your thoughts and subscribe to the channel. Stories only truly live when they resonate with others. Comment on what impacted you the most, which character surprised you the most, and what part of Henry and Ava's journey resonated with you. Your opinion helps bring new narratives, new worlds, and new emotions to life. Thank you for following along this far. Now tell me, what story do you want to live next?